10. Joe and Shannon AGOFSKY. On October 6, 1989, there was a different kind of robbery that unfolded at the Stank Bank in Noel, a sleepy town in Missouri. Over $70,000 in cash was taken from the bank while it was closed, and yet there was no sign of forced entry. The alarms hadn't been set off, the windows weren't broken, and the door hadn't been pried open. But that wasn't the only strange part of it. When the thieves were inside the bank, they shot out the surveillance cameras and stole bags full of coins. Even for 1989, that was a pretty bizarre thing to do. The FBI focused their attention on the local bank president, Dan Short. He lived alone in rural Arkansas and wasn't responding to their phone calls. Investigators soon learned that one of his neighbors had seen him be abducted by two individuals and then driven away in a brown van. Days later, on October 11th, a couple fishing on Grand Lake in Oklahoma, about 20 miles or 32 kilometers from the scene of the crime, found Dan Short's body dead in the water. He had been bound to a chair with duct tape, weighted with a huge concrete block, and lowered into the lake. He definitely wasn't supposed to have surfaced so early on. Investigators soon located their main suspects, Joe and Shannon AGOFSKY. Witnesses the police spoke to said that the siblings had been bragging about stealing a huge number of coins. This was a red flag, and the whole reason the FBI were made aware of their names in the first place. Both of them had alibis, and there was nothing directly linking them to the crimes, and so they walked free. But their freedom didn't last for long. The duct tape that had been used on Dan Short's body contained visible fingerprints. The FBI used these prints and matched them with the AGOFSKY brothers. And in the fall of 1992, the brothers were sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years. Shannon was given the death sentence in 2004 after slaughtering an inmate at a federal prison in Texas. His brother Joe died in 2013 while still incarcerated. 9. Cannibal brothers. In 2014, two brothers in central Pakistan were arrested for the second time over accusations of cannibalism. They were arrested on suspicion of consuming dead bodies that they had dug up from a nearby graveyard. Police believe they were grave robbing their victims, then cooking their body parts into disgusting dishes. Their house was raided after the neighbors started complaining about a terrible stench wafting off their property. Plus, their neighbors were already suspicious since they'd seen the brothers, identified as Farman and Arif Ali, hanging around the graveyard at night. Inside the house, the police discovered body parts, a human skull, and cooking instruments that had likely been used in their bizarre culinary adventure. This was the second time they were caught allegedly eating dead people, and we still have no idea what motivated them to do such a thing. What we do know is that under Pakistani law, cannibalism isn't technically a crime, and so the men are only being charged with the crime of dehumanizing a body. 8. The Crypto Heist brothers. Amir and Rais Kaji, two brothers from South Africa, set up a crypto investment service in 2019 called AfriCrypt. Several years after being in business in April of 2021, at a time when the price of Bitcoin was through the roof, the brothers sent an email to their investors informing them that their company had suffered a hack attack. They asked their investors to please not contact the authorities, or it would slow down their efforts to recover the cash lost in the hacking. Naturally, the investors contacted the authorities anyway. An investigation soon unveiled that the funds from the company had been transferred from South African bank accounts into client wallets, then siphoned from there into untraceable accounts. And since then, the brothers have vanished, and nobody has any idea where they are. Amir and Rais, along with $3.6 billion in accumulated cash from investors, are gone. It turned out to be one of the biggest cryptocurrency heists in history, and the brothers still haven't been tracked down. They, so far, have gotten away with almost $4 billion. 7. Ron and Dan Lafferty. Brothers Ron and Dan Lafferty were both into the Mormon faith in the 1940s in Utah. They were part of a family of 4 brothers, 2 sisters, and their parents. Their father was an angry man who occasionally beat his wife and even murdered the family dog in front of his kids. He was distrustful of medicine, refused to let his kids go to the hospital even after one of them was shot in the stomach with an arrow, and was undoubtedly the most influential figure in Ron and Dan's lives because when they grew up, they were just like their father. By the 1980s, Ron and Dan had been excommunicated from the Mormon Church. They joined up with a polygamist cult known as the School of Prophets, and in a short span of time, they became the leaders of the church. Once they had gained that status, Ron claimed that he himself had communicated directly with God. This was the beginning of one of the most heinous murders in cult history. Ron proclaimed himself a prophet and said that a revelation from God had instructed him to remove several people from their group. One of the people was his sister-in-law, Brenda Wright Lafferty. Another was her 15-month-old daughter, Erica. On July 24, 1984, Ron and Dan ended both their lives. Ron and Dan had been living in their own private world, away from the law and away from any social judgment. But once they committed these awful murders, they found themselves at the mercy of civilized courts. They were both brought to trial, and Dan was sentenced to 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Ron was sentenced to death, only to have that conviction reversed. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, sent to a mental hospital, and then retried in 1996. Ron was found guilty and once more sentenced to die. He requested to be killed by firing squad, but would die in prison of natural causes in November of 2019 while still waiting for the execution. He was 78 years old. 6. The 1977 Arizona armored car robbery. A daring armed robbery took place on May 24, 1977, along Interstate 17 in Arizona. Russell Dempsey and Cecil Newkirk were working for Purolator Courier, driving an armored vehicle, when they saw police lights in the rearview mirror. They pulled over, assuming the vehicle behind them was an actual police cruiser. What the drivers didn't realize was that they were about to be held up by the Poland brothers. The Poland brothers killed them, stuffed their bodies into bags, and dumped them in Lake Mead. They also got away with $228,000 in cash from the truck. The FBI canvassed the area and soon found a service station owner who reported something suspicious. He said that he had towed a pickup truck that had accidentally backed into Lake Mead the day after the robbery. The 2 men claimed to be fishing, yet they had no fishing equipment. It was strange, but the service station owner just did his job and didn't argue. The receipt for the bill was signed by Michael Poland. The simple mistake of backing their truck into the lake while dumping the bodies of the 2 armored truck workers was what brought the investigators to Michael Poland's door. On May 18, 1978, a year after the crime, Michael and Patrick Poland were arrested. After a very long and dramatic trial, the Poland brothers were given death sentences. In 1997, Michael Poland attempted to escape. His cell contained an escape plan, the keys to handcuffs, and a lockpick. He only got busted because he tried to bribe a prison guard with $2 million to help him escape. On June 16, 1999, Michael Poland was executed. 9 months later, on March 15, 2000, Patrick Poland was also executed. 5. Owen and Gary Shover. 16-year-old Aranda Briones was last seen on January 13, 2019. She was visiting some friends in the Moreno Valley in California at the time. Her family reported her missing when she didn't arrive home. Some of the first people to be interviewed by the police were brothers Owen and Gary Shover. Owen and Gary, 21 and 25 respectively, were supposed to be Aranda's friends. They told the police that they dropped her off at the community park and then went home themselves. They claimed that when they last saw Rhonda, she was still alive and breathing. But thanks to efforts by the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, these brothers were discovered to be liars. According to Sheriff's Deputy Michael Vasquez, the investigators absolutely destroyed the timeline of events given by the brothers. They used surveillance footage to help dismantle the brothers' lies, and finally had enough evidence to arrest them. Owen and Gary are now being held without bail on charges of murder, even though Rhonda still hasn't been found. It's been over 3 years and they still haven't admitted where her body is, despite the fact that they're looking at life in prison for her murder. 4. Twin bank robbers. On June 28, 2022, Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers in Saanich, BC, responded to a robbery at the Bank of Montreal. This was what the experts call a militarized takeover bank robbery. 2 men walked into the bank armed as if they were going to war. The bank robbers demanded everyone get down on the ground. They brandished high-powered rifles, and they were eerily calm and collected during the whole thing. According to Lisa, one of the women who was in the bank when it was robbed, both the men were almost surreally composed. They weren't agitated. They waited patiently and in complete silence as the vault door was opened, and then they filled their bag with cash. But before the bank robbers could leave, the police showed up, and the Canadian police were not messing around. Almost immediately upon the arrival of the cops, it turned into a violent shootout. The brothers hunkered down inside the bank with people they could have easily taken as human hostages, and they fired at the cops. 6 officers were wounded by the bank robbers, and both robbers were killed in the exchange of gunfire. It was a bloody and brutal battle, though no cops or civilians lost their lives. The bank robbers were later identified as Matthew and Isaac Ochterlony, a pair of seemingly ordinary young men. They were both only 22 years old, locals of British Columbia, and hadn't really gotten in any major trouble their whole lives. A month later, we still don't know what inspired them to arm themselves to the teeth and stick up a bank. 3. John and Tony Reed. In April of 2016, Patrick Shunn and his wife Monique Patenaude went missing. The police immediately suspected some kind of foul play, and one of the main suspects was John Reed, their neighbor. The police soon learned that John Reed and his neighbors had been involved in a property dispute in their small town of Oso, Washington. John's property had been destroyed by a mudslide, and he accepted a federal disaster buyout. The buyout meant that his land no longer belonged to him, and yet he continued squatting on it anyway. And this seriously upset his neighbors. And so, John killed them. At least that's according to the testimony his brother Tony recently gave in court. Tony said that John called him up, asked if they could drive across the mountains together, and then admitted during the drive that he had killed his neighbors. With Tony's help, John got rid of the bodies. They drove way up into the Washington mountains in the dark, then wandered through the woods until they found a spot where a tree had blown over. And there they dug the graves. But it was already too late. The police were searching for John. He had to get out of the country. Tony then went with John to Arizona and crossed into Mexico to hide. But after a little while, Tony became scared that the Mexican police might shoot him if they were found out. So he returned to the American border and gave himself up. He then gave up his brother and led the police to where the bodies were hidden, and he was given 14 months in prison for criminal assistance. John, on the other hand, was captured and given life in prison for murder. 2. The Harpes brothers. The Harpes brothers are considered to be the very first American serial killers. Micaiah Harpe and Wiley Harpe were murderous outlaws in the late 1700s, operating throughout the American South. And while they were technically cousins, they did pass themselves off as brothers, and there's no way anyone would have known the difference. During the American Revolution, the brothers sided with the British, but they didn't actually care about the British Empire. All they wanted to do was pillage and kill. They burned down farms, assaulted women in their houses, and pillaged the corpses of American patriots. In the year 1780, the brothers joined with British troops to fight battles along the borders of North and South Carolina. Then they abandoned the war, joined up with some Cherokee Indians, and continued their pillaging. They kidnapped the daughter of Captain James Wood, a couple of other young girls, and forced them to be their wives. They retreated to the Cherokee settlement of Nickajack, near modern-day Chattanooga, and for a dozen years lived a simple life with their stolen brides. In 1798, the brothers went on a legit murder spree. They killed 2 men in Tennessee, moved into Kentucky, and killed a pair of traveling men from Maryland. They were entirely motivated by bloodlust, often leaving their victims in despicable states of mutilation. The Harpes killed an estimated 40 men, women, and children, and then were eventually caught and killed themselves. A posse tracked them down in 1799, and Micaiah Harpe was shot in the back. Wiley Harpe got away and was captured 5 years later in 1804, hanged, and his head placed on a stake along the Natchez Road. 1. Hit by a boat. In June of 2022, 2 brothers in Indiana were arrested after one of them drove into a police officer with a boat. It happened after the brothers broke into a floating restaurant on the Ohio River. According to the Madison Police Department, the men were witnessed climbing over the gate and into the Lighthouse restaurant at about 2 o'clock in the morning on June 25th. Officers responded to the scene immediately. The brothers were still inside, but they refused to come out. Seeing no other choice, some of the police then climbed over the gate and tried to arrest the brothers. They managed to get one of them, Evan Meyer, into custody, but the other brother escaped. 45-year-old Stephen Meyer managed to get away into a boat. Then he drove it straight into the dock, where one of the officers was standing. The boat hit the dock and rammed the officer in the shoulder, and then Stephen took off in the boat as quickly as he could. The officer wasn't injured, although it was definitely a jarring experience. The boat was later found abandoned on the beach, and Stephen Meyer was discovered hiding nearby. The brothers are now facing charges of battery on a public safety officer, resisting law enforcement, and public intoxication. We don't know why they thought it was a good idea to rob the restaurant, but it almost certainly had something to do with too much drinking booze. Would you rather have a twin brother or a twin sister as a psychotic killer? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe, and come back soon for another surprising video.